In 1852, Beaufort County, South Carolina, was home to a prosperous cotton plantation where unwritten rules governed life and death. Among the colonial mansions and slave quarters, power was measured not just in acres or cotton bales, but in fear itself. This is a story about a peculiar method of revenge, a tale of patience, calculated justice, and the thin line between survival and vengeance. It began with a young slave named Simon, a hungry pack, and 20 years of silent, accumulated hatred. What happened at Harding Plantation during that cold winter of 1852 would forever change how an entire community viewed the line between civilization and barbarism. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you thinking for days. Because how Simon used those bloodhounds to settle his score? Well, some revenge is so calculated that it takes decades to be discovered. When the truth finally comes to light, it's already too late for everyone involved. In the harsh winter of 1852, Beaufort County, South Carolina housed some of the state's most prosperous cotton plantations. Among them, the Harding Plantation stood out, not just for the quality of its lands, but for something far more sinister: the systematic use of bloodhounds to hunt runaway slaves. These dogs, specifically trained to track human scent, represented terror in its purest form for those who dreamed of freedom. The story I'm about to tell remained buried for decades, whispered only among the freed who guarded their secrets until safety allowed them to speak. It's a narrative that reveals how the brutality of a system can forge vengeance as meticulous as it is devastating. An investigation that began with 2 disappearances ended with revelations that shook the power structures of an entire region. This isn't just another story about American slavery. It's the account of how hatred, when fermented in silence for years, can explode in ways that challenge our understanding of justice and revenge. The events that unfolded at the Harding Plantation in December 1852 remained officially unsolved. But the truth, as always, found its way through the voices of those who lived to tell it. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. The Harding Plantation stretched across 800 acres along the Kami River, its fertile lands producing long staple cotton that fed textile factories in northern England. But what truly defined Nest Harding's property wasn't its exceptional harvests, but rather the 6 bloodhounds that lived in specially built kennels near the main house. These animals, each weighing between 80 and 100 pounds, were instruments of psychological terror, as effective as any chain or whip. Ernest Harding, at 50 years old, had inherited the plantation from his father and expanded both the lands and the methods of control. A man of imposing stature and cold gaze, he believed that severe discipline was the only language slaves understood. His son Jasper, 25 years old, had been molded in his image, cruel, calculating, and completely devoid of empathy. Together, father and son administered the plantation with an iron fist, using the bloodhounds as their most powerful psychological weapon. The dogs were trained from puppyhood to track the specific human scent of slaves. When someone tried to escape, the animals were released with a piece of the person's clothing as an olfactory reference. What happened when the dogs caught up with the fugitive was rarely discussed openly, but the screams that echoed through the forest during these hunts served as a constant reminder to all other slaves about the price of disobedience. Simon was different from the other slaves since childhood. Born on the plantation in 1832, he demonstrated from an early age a sharp intelligence and an unusual capacity for observation. At 14, when most slave boys were sent to work in the cotton fields, Simon was assigned to care for the bloodhounds. This decision, made by Ernest Harding himself, was based on the perception that the boy possessed a natural connection with the animals. Simon's work involved feeding the dogs, cleaning their kennels, and preparing them for hunts. He learned to prepare olfactory baits, interpret their behaviors, and maintain the animals in a state of controlled semi-starvation that made them more aggressive during pursuits. Over time, he became the only slave on the plantation with unrestricted access to the bloodhounds, a position that conferred upon him a unique status and mobility that other slaves didn't possess. The trust that Ernest and Jasper placed in Simon was absolute. They saw him as an example of the ideal domestic slave, silent, obedient, and apparently grateful for his privileged position. Simon never questioned orders, never showed resistance, and always executed his tasks with mechanical efficiency. This facade of loyalty was meticulously constructed over the years, each gesture calculated to reinforce the perception that he was completely trustworthy. But behind the submissive eyes and hunched posture, Simon nurtured a hatred that grew like a malignant tumor. He observed everything: the family's routines, movement patterns around the property, the vulnerabilities of each member of the Harding family. His unique position allowed him access to information that no other slave possessed, and he archived every detail in his memory with the precision of a military strategist. Life at the Harding plantation followed a brutal and predictable rhythm. The 22 slaves woke before dawn to the sound of the bell that Jasper personally rang, a practice he considered part of his authority. Breakfast consisted of watery corn porridge and, on lucky days, a piece of rancid bacon. Workdays extended from sunrise to sunset with only a brief pause at midday for an equally meager meal. Punishments on the plantation were public and elaborate, designed not only to punish the transgressor, but to terrorize all others. The pillory stood in the center of the slave quarters courtyard, a wooden structure stained with the blood of countless victims. Whipping sessions were conducted by Leonis Garrett, the overseer, a 35-year-old man whose cruelty was legendary, even by the standards of the time. Garrett used a braided leather whip with metal tips capable of tearing chunks of flesh with each blow. Simon witnessed hundreds of these punishments over the years. Forced to watch like all other slaves, he learned to maintain an impassive face while observing men and women being destroyed for minimal infractions. Arriving late to work, breaking a tool, or simply looking insolently at a member of the Harding family. Each scream, each plea for mercy, each drop of spilled blood was recorded in his memory as fuel for the fire that burned within him. During the cold December nights, when exhaustion should have brought restorative sleep, Simon remained awake, planning. He memorized the schedules of night rounds, studied the dog's behavior patterns during different weather conditions, and observed the routes that Ernest and Jasper used when leaving the property. The intense winter cold had changed some routines on the plantation, creating opportunities that Simon observed with growing interest. The arrival of the harsh winter of 1852 brought significant changes to the plantation's routine. Workdays were shorter due to the cold, but conditions in the slave quarters became even more precarious. Ernest and Jasper seemed particularly satisfied with the year's profits, openly discussing their plans to expand operations in the next season. During these conversations, Simon learned they were planning a business trip to Charleston in early December, taking advantage of the calmer period after the harvest. What Simon didn't know was that Ernest had begun to suspect subtle changes in some slaves' behavior. The owner had noticed longer stares, whispers that ceased when he approached, and an almost imperceptible tension in the air. His natural paranoia, sharpened by years of control through fear, made him question whether some conspiracy was forming among the slaves. He had instructed Leonis Garrett to intensify surveillance, especially during the nights. The tension on the plantation was palpable during those December days. The slaves worked under the cutting cold and constant pressure of increased surveillance, while punishments for any failure became even more severe. Simon maintained his facade of silent obedience, but internally felt that the moment of truth was approaching. Each passing day brought him closer to executing a plan he had been refining for 3 years, waiting only for the perfect opportunity that the harsh winter would finally provide. The tragedy that shaped Simon's destiny began in the winter of 1849 when his sister, Elena, was only 17 years old. She worked in the main house as a domestic, responsible for cleaning rooms and washing the Harding family's clothes. Elena was a young woman of remarkable beauty, with expressive eyes and a smile that could illuminate even the darkest days in the slave quarters. Her presence brought hope to a community constantly subjected to brutality and despair. The plantation's former overseer, Morai Thorne, was a 40-year-old man known for his exceptional cruelty, even by the standards of the time. Unlike Leonis Garrett, who would later replace him, Thorne found sadistic pleasure not only in physical violence but also in the sexual humiliation of female slaves. He had developed a perverse system where he selected young slave women for special services, always with Ernest Harding's tacit approval. Elena tried to resist Thorne's advances for weeks, but the resistance of a teenage slave girl against a white man in a position of authority was not only useless, but dangerous. Thorne's threats were specific and terrifying. He promised to have Simon devoured alive by the bloodhounds if she continued to reject him. The emotional blackmail worked perfectly, and Elena submitted to the abuse to protect her brother. The abuse continued for months, always in secret, always accompanied by increasingly elaborate threats. Thorne forced Elena to meet him in different locations on the plantation, in the barn during nights, in the main house when the family was absent, and even in the forest near the bloodhound kennels as a perverse way to reinforce his threats. Each encounter left not only physical but deep psychological marks on the young woman. Simon noticed the changes in his sister long before discovering the cause. Elena, who had always been communicative and affectionate, became withdrawn and silent. She avoided eye contact, startled at sudden noises, and developed the habit of washing her hands compulsively. When Simon tried to talk to her, Elena would change the subject or simply walk away, carrying a burden she refused to share. The discovery of Elena's pregnancy came at the end of summer 1849, when she could no longer hide the changes in her body. The news spread quickly through the slave quarters, but no one dared speculate openly about the child's paternity. Everyone knew that questioning the origin of a pregnancy involving a young and attractive slave could result in severe punishments for the entire community. Silence was a form of collective self-preservation that Simon observed with growing bitterness. Ernest Harding reacted to Elena's pregnancy with the calculating coldness that characterized all his business decisions. For him, a pregnant slave represented both a future investment and an immediate logistical problem. The solution in his mind was simple and profitable: sell her to another plantation before the pregnancy became too advanced. The decision was made without consulting anyone, as if Elena were just another piece of property to be traded. The sale was arranged with a speed that left the entire slave community in shock. Less than a week after the discovery, a slave trader from Savannah arrived at the plantation with documents already prepared. Elena was evaluated as if she were livestock, her teeth examined, her muscles tested, her pregnancy confirmed by a humiliating examination conducted in front of strangers. The agreed price was $800, an amount Ernest considered satisfactory to solve the problem. Simon watched his sister's sale from outside the main house, forced to maintain a neutral expression while his world collapsed. He saw Elena chained alongside other slaves in the trader's wagon, her eyes meeting his for one last moment before she was taken away forever. In that instant, something fundamental broke inside Simon. The pain of separation transformed into a cold and calculating rage that would define every subsequent day of his life. Dorinda, Simon and Elena's mother, never recovered from losing her daughter. At 44 years old, she had survived decades of slavery, lost her husband, sold to another plantation when Simon was a child, and endured countless humiliations and privations. But Elena's sale represented an emotional break from which she couldn't recover. Dorinda began to waste away physically, refusing to eat properly and losing interest in everything around her. Dorinda's death came in early March 1850, 6 months after Elena's sale. She died during the night in silence, as if she had simply decided to stop fighting. Simon found his mother's body the next morning, cold and rigid, with an expression of peace that contrasted dramatically with the suffering of recent months. The funeral was a simple ceremony in the lands designated for the slave cemetery, a swampy area at the back of the property where dozens of anonymous souls had been buried over the years. After his mother's death, Simon became a completely different person. Externally, he maintained the same facade of silent obedience that had always characterized his behavior. But internally, he had transformed into something much more dangerous, a man with nothing to lose and a singular objective. He began observing Morai Thorne with new intensity, studying his habits, his roots, his vulnerabilities. The opportunity to act against Thorne came in the summer of 1850, when the overseer was found dead under mysterious circumstances. His body was discovered in the forest near the plantation, apparently the victim of an accident during a solitary hunt. The official investigation concluded that Thorne had tripped and hit his head on a rock, but there were disturbing details that were never adequately explained. Wounds that appeared to have been caused by animal teeth and the fact that the plantation's bloodhounds were particularly agitated that morning. Simon was never questioned about Thorne's death, as his presence on the plantation throughout the night had been confirmed by multiple witnesses. but those who knew him well noticed a subtle change in his behavior after the incident. He seemed calmer, more focused, as if a weight had been removed from his shoulders. Thorne's death had provided temporary satisfaction, but Simon knew that the true responsible party for his family's destruction was still alive and prospering. Lioness Garrett was hired as the new overseer a few weeks after Thorne's death. Garrett was equally cruel, but in a more systematic and less personally sadistic way. He saw brutality as a necessary work tool, not as a source of personal pleasure. This difference in temperament made life on the plantation slightly more predictable, but no less brutal. Punishments continued, abuse persisted, and the system of psychological terror represented by the bloodhounds remained intact. During the following 2 years, Simon perfected his art of invisibility and observation. He became a dedicated student of human behavior, analyzing each member of the Harding family with the precision of a naturalist studying specimens. Ernest was predictable in his routine and arrogant in his sense of security. Jasper was impulsive and cruel, but also careless and easily manipulated. Adelaide, the youngest daughter, was an unknown that Simon observed with growing curiosity. The arrival of the harsh winter of 1852 brought with it the sensation that something fundamental was about to change. Simon could feel the tension in the air, like an animal that senses a storm before the first clouds appear on the horizon. He had spent 3 years planning, observing, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Now, with Ernest and Jasper's annual trip to Charleston approaching, and with the intense cold creating ideal conditions for preserving evidence for a limited time, Simon knew that the moment of truth had finally arrived. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the unfolding of this disturbing investigation. Adelaide Harding returned to the Harding plantation in early December 1852 after completing her studies at the Charleston Female Seminary. At 19 years old, she had transformed from a spoiled girl into a young woman with ideas that would deeply shock her family. During her 3 years of formal education, Adelaide had been exposed to abolitionist currents of thought that circulated discreetly among some intellectual circles in Charleston, planting seeds of doubt about the system that sustained her family's wealth. Adelaide's transformation didn't go unnoticed by Simon, who observed her attentively since her return. She now openly questioned certain plantation practices, expressed discomfort with the brutality of punishments, and demonstrated an empathy for slaves that was completely foreign to the Harding mentality. During family meals, her questions about the slaves' well-being caused visible tension between Ernest and Jasper, creating fissures in family unity that Simon observed with strategic interest. Ernest Harding reacted to the changes in his daughter with a mixture of irritation and determination. He attributed Adelaide's dangerous ideas to the influence of liberal teachers in Charleston and was convinced that direct exposure to the reality of slavery would cure his daughter of these abolitionist fantasies. His solution was simple and brutal. Ernest forced Adelaide to witness public punishments, believing that direct experience would make her understand the inferior nature of blacks. The first punishment Adelaide was forced to witness after her return involved a slave named Joshua, 18 years old, who had been accused of stealing a piece of bacon from the pantry. The accusation was probably false, based only on Lioness Garrett's word, but this was irrelevant in the plantation's justice system. Joshua was tied to the pillory in the center of the slave quarters courtyard, while all slaves were forced to form a circle around to watch the punishment. Adelaide was positioned beside her father and brother in a chair specially brought from the main house for the occasion. Ernest calmly explained that she needed to learn to maintain discipline and that demonstrations of weakness would be interpreted by slaves as signs that they could take advantage of her feminine nature. Jasper added with a cruel smile that educating blacks was an art that required absolute firmness and that Adelaide needed to harden her heart. Lioness Garrett conducted the punishment with his usual efficiency. Each blow drew screams from Joshua that echoed through the courtyard, while blood began to flow down the young man's back. Adelaide watched the first 5 blows in silence, but when the 6th blow tore a piece of flesh from Joshua's back, she vomited violently, doubling over herself while her body rejected the horror her eyes had witnessed. Ernest showed no compassion for his daughter's reaction. On the contrary, he forced her to remain seated until all 20 blows were completed, holding her firmly by the arm when she tried to get up. Jasper laughed at the situation. commenting that Adelaide was too weak to be a true Harding. Adelaide's public humiliation in front of the slaves created a complex dynamic that Simon observed with growing interest. In the following days, Ernest intensified Adelaide's educational exercises, forcing her to accompany Lyonis Garrett during his daily rounds and witness other forms of discipline. Each punishment left Adelaide more traumatized and, paradoxically, more convinced that the system was fundamentally evil. Instead of hardening her heart as Ernest expected, the experiences strengthened her abolitionist convictions and created in her a growing determination to find ways to alleviate the slaves' suffering. What Ernest didn't realize was that his strategy was creating exactly the opposite of the desired effect. Adelaide began asking more specific questions about plantation practices, questioning not only the methods but the very morality of slavery. She discovered, through conversations with domestic slaves, details about the sexual abuse that had occurred under Thorne and that occasionally still happened under Garrett. These revelations horrified her deeply and strengthened her determination to act. The situation reached a breaking point when Adelaide tried to intervene during a punishment. A young slave named Mercy had been accused of breaking a piece of porcelain in the main house, and Jasper had ordered that she receive 10 lashes. When Lyonis Garrett raised the whip for the first blow, Adelaide stood up from her chair and shouted, "Stop!" with an authority that surprised everyone present, including herself. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Jasper was furious with his sister's interference, shouting that she was shaming the family and encouraging insubordination among the slaves. Ernest supported his son, declaring that Adelaide had completely lost her mind and needed to be corrected before she caused irreparable damage to the plantation's discipline. Adelaide, in turn, accused her father and brother of being monsters and declared that she would no longer participate in any punishment. The family discussion continued in the main house for hours, with voices being heard even in the slave quarters. Adelaide threatened to write to relatives in Charleston about the atrocities she was being forced to witness, while Ernest threatened to confine his daughter to her quarters until she regained her senses. Jasper suggested that Adelaide be sent to an asylum for hysterical women, a threat she took very seriously, knowing her family's disposition for extreme measures. Simon realized that this family instability created exactly the kind of distraction he needed to execute his plans. Ernest and Jasper were so focused on correcting Adelaide that their attention was diverted from the plantation's routine operations. They constantly discussed the best way to deal with Adelaide's rebellion, leaving other aspects of administration in the background. This preoccupation made them more vulnerable and less vigilant. What Simon didn't know was that Adelaide had begun to suspect that something was being planned among the slaves. Her new sensitivity to the system's injustices had made her more observant of subtle behaviors in the slave community. She noticed significant looks exchanged between certain slaves, conversations that ceased abruptly when she approached, and a growing tension that seemed concentrated around Simon and Joshua. Although she didn't fully understand what was happening, Adelaide felt that a fundamental change was approaching. Ernest and Jasper's decision to make their annual trip to Charleston was influenced, in part by the desire to consult other plantation owners about how to deal with Adelaide. They planned to discuss the situation with experienced men who could offer advice on how to control a rebellious daughter. The trip would also serve as a necessary break from family tensions, allowing them to focus on business while leaving Adelaide alone to reflect on her behavior. During preparations for the trip, Simon noticed that Ernest and Jasper were more careless than usual with their plans and routes. They openly discussed departure times, specific destinations, and the expected duration of the trip, information that Simon silently absorbed while caring for the bloodhounds near the main house. The intense winter cold had changed some of their usual routines, creating opportunities that Simon observed with growing interest. The night before Ernest and Jasper's departure was marked by one last family discussion about Adelaide. Ernest left specific instructions for her to be supervised by Lyonis Garrett during his absence, and that any inappropriate behavior should be reported immediately upon his return. Adelaide, in turn, declared that she would use the time alone to reflect on the immoral nature of the system that sustained the family's wealth, a declaration that left Ernest visibly disturbed. Simon spent that last night awake, mentally reviewing every aspect of his plan. He had waited 3 years for this opportunity and knew there wouldn't be a second chance. The intense winter cold created perfect conditions for preserving evidence for a few days, enough time to execute his revenge and eliminate the traces. In a few hours, the revenge he had meticulously planned would finally be executed, and this time he would be the one controlling his oppressor's destiny. Ernest and Jasper Harding departed from the plantation on the cold morning of December 10, 1852, in a carriage loaded with cotton samples and commercial documents for their annual trip to Charleston. The route they would follow was well known, a dirt road that wound through forests of pines and oaks for approximately 8 miles before connecting with the main road. The intense winter cold had made the road firmer, but also more dangerous due to ice patches that formed in shaded areas. Simon had studied this route meticulously during previous years, walking along it during his plantation tasks and memorizing every curve, every fallen tree, every point where the forest became denser. He knew exactly where the road passed through a particularly isolated area, just 1 mile from the main house, where the trees formed such a dense canopy that even during the day, sunlight could barely penetrate. The location was perfect, close enough to facilitate transport, but isolated enough to guarantee privacy. On the morning of departure, Simon followed his normal routine of caring for the bloodhounds, but there was a subtle difference in his behavior that only the dogs seemed to perceive. They were more agitated than usual, sniffing the air intensely and watching Simon with attention that bordered on expectation. After completing his morning tasks, he discreetly headed to the abandoned barn at the back of the property, where he had hidden the tools he would need for weeks. The arsenal Simon had assembled was simple but effective: a woodsman's axe, 2 sharp butcher knives he had borrowed from the main house kitchen, resistant ropes, and a waterproof tarp he would use to transport the bodies. More importantly, he had discovered an old bear trap at the back of the property, a rusty iron device that had been forgotten for years. Simon had cleaned and secretly tested it during nights. Discovering it still worked perfectly. Simon's plan was brutally simple but required perfect timing and the collaboration of Joshua, the young slave who had been brutally whipped in front of Adelaide weeks before. Joshua had survived the punishment, but the physical and psychological scars had transformed him into someone willing to risk everything for revenge. During whispered conversations in the slave quarters, Simon had recruited Joshua as his accomplice, promising him the opportunity to participate in destroying those who had tortured them. Approximately 1 hour after Ernest and Jasper's departure, Simon and Joshua headed through the forest to the ambush point that had been chosen. The intense cold made each breath visible but also muffled sounds, creating a sepulchral silence that would be perfect for their purposes. They strategically positioned the old trap on the road, camouflaged under leaves and branches, while hiding on opposite sides of the road behind century-old trees. The sound of the approaching carriage echoed through the forest about 20 minutes later. Simon could hear Ernest and Jasper's voices casually discussing their business plans, completely oblivious to the danger awaiting them. The cold had made the horses slower and more cautious, causing the carriage to advance at a speed that would be perfect for the ambush Simon had planned. When the carriage's front wheel hit the hidden trap, the device closed with a metallic snap that echoed through the forest. The horses reared in panic, causing the carriage to overturn violently and throwing Ernest and Jasper onto the frozen ground. Ernest screamed in pain when his ankle was crushed by the trap, while Jasper, stunned by the fall, desperately tried to orient himself in the midst of chaos. Simon and Joshua emerged simultaneously from their hiding places, moving with the precision of experienced predators. Simon jumped on Jasper, knocking him down with the axe handle before he could react completely. Joshua attacked Ernest, who was immobilized by the trap, using one of the ropes to gag him before his screams could echo too far through the forest. In less than 5 minutes, both men were tied up and defenseless. The execution was methodical and prolonged. Simon wanted both men to fully understand what was happening, to know exactly why they were dying. He began by calmly explaining how they had destroyed his family, reminding them of every injustice, every humiliation, every moment of suffering they had caused. Ernest and Jasper, terrified and immobilized, could only listen, while Simon methodically detailed their crimes. Joshua actively participated in the execution, using the knives to inflict wounds that caused intense pain without killing immediately. He had observed animal slaughter on the plantation for years. Basic knowledge he now applied with terrible efficiency. The intense winter cold helped slow blood loss, prolonging the victim's agony in a way that would be impossible in warmer temperatures. When he finally delivered the fatal blows, Simon felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, relief, and emptiness. The revenge was consummated, but he knew the most dangerous part of his plan was still to come, completely eliminating any evidence of the murders. The intense winter cold created perfect conditions for preserving meat for 1 or 2 days, enough time to feed the bloodhounds without arousing suspicion. Working quickly in the cutting cold, Simon and Joshua began dismembering the bodies using the sharp knives they had brought. The work was crude and brutal, without any anatomical precision, just rustic cuts intended to divide the bodies into pieces that could be easily transported. The cold made the work more difficult but also cleaner, with less blood spreading around the site. The carriage horses had fled in panic during the attack, but this was part of Simon's plan. Loose horses would eventually be found, but without the carriage or its occupants, creating confusion about what had happened. Simon and Joshua methodically destroyed the carriage. Breaking it into small pieces, they scattered through the forest in different directions, burying some fragments in the muddy earth that had begun to soften. With the recent rain, Ernest and Jasper's clothes and personal belongings were carefully collected and hidden in different forest locations far from the crime scene. Simon knew that eventually some of these items would be discovered, but scattered over a wide area and buried in the wet earth, they would create more confusion than clarification for any future investigation. The transport of dismembered flesh back to the plantation was done in 2 trips during the afternoon, with Simon and Joshua carrying the tarp through the forest to the abandoned barn where they had hidden the tools. The intense cold helped preserve the meat, but Simon knew he needed to act quickly to avoid deterioration. They temporarily stored the remains in salt barrels that Simon had borrowed from the main house during previous weeks. During the following 2 days, Simon resumed his normal activities with a calm that surprised even himself. He fed the bloodhounds their usual meals, but now included small portions of human flesh mixed with normal food. The intense cold had made the dogs hungrier than usual, and they voraciously consumed the additional meat without demonstrating any behavior that could arouse suspicion. Joshua also maintained his normal routine, working in the fields, even in the intense cold, and avoiding any behavior that could draw attention. The collaboration between the 2 men had been perfect, based on a mutual understanding that their survival depended on maintaining absolute secrecy about the events in the forest. The cold created a natural excuse for slightly different behaviors, such as trembling or slower movements. Adelaide noticed that Simon seemed calmer than usual in the days following her father and brother's departure, but she attributed this to relief from not having to participate in the brutal education sessions that Ernest had imposed. She herself was taking advantage of her father and brother's absence to implement changes in the plantation's routine, suspending public punishments and improving the slaves' living conditions, creating a more relaxed atmosphere that inadvertently helped Simon maintain his facade of normalcy. 10 days had passed since Ernest and Jasper Harding's departure, and the prolonged absence of the 2 men began to generate genuine concern on the plantation. Lioness Garrett, who had initially enjoyed the freedom of administering the property without constant supervision, now faced practical questions that required decisions beyond his authority. Local merchants had arrived expecting to negotiate with Ernest, and commercial correspondence was accumulating that required immediate attention. Adelaide was also worried, though for different reasons. Despite her philosophical differences with her father and brother, she couldn't imagine they would remain in Charleston for so long without sending at least a letter explaining the delay. Ernest was meticulous in his commercial communications, and Jasper always maintained regular contact with the family during trips. The total absence of news was completely out of character for both, especially considering the family tensions that had preceded the trip. Garrett decided to take the initiative and personally investigate Ernest and Jasper's whereabouts. On the morning of December 20th, he saddled his horse and departed to travel the route the 2 men had followed, planning to visit towns and inns along the way to Charleston. The intense cold made the journey dangerous, but Garrett was genuinely concerned about his employer's fate and determined to discover what had happened. Garrett's investigation revealed disturbing information. In Beaufort, the nearest town, he discovered that Ernest and Jasper had never arrived, despite having departed from the plantation with enough time to complete the journey in one day. The innkeeper where they usually stayed confirmed he had received no reservation or communication from the two men. Local merchants, who expected to meet them, also confirmed they never appeared for scheduled appointments. Alarmed by these discoveries, Garrett expanded his investigation to other towns along the route to Charleston. At each stop, the story was the same. No one had seen Ernest and Jasper Harding since their departure from the plantation. It was as if the two men had simply vanished from the face of the earth at some point between the Harding plantation and their first destination. This discovery transformed Garrett's concern into genuine panic, especially considering growing rumors about abolitionist activities in the region. The overseer returned to the plantation on the afternoon of December 23rd with news that left Adelaide visibly shaken. The possibility that something terrible had happened to her father and brother, despite her differences with them, was devastating. Adelaide immediately instructed Garrett to contact local authorities and organize a formal search. She also sent urgent messages to relatives in Charleston, hoping someone had news of the two men. The county sheriff, Thomas Whitmore, arrived at the plantation on the morning of December 25th, accompanied by two deputies and a local tracker named Ezra Collins. Whitmore was a 45-year-old man with decades of investigation experience, known for his methodical approach and ability to extract information from reluctant witnesses. His presence on the plantation created an atmosphere of tension that affected all residents, slaves and whites equally. The investigation began with detailed interrogations of Adelaide, Leonis Garrett, and other white plantation employees. Whitmore wanted to establish a precise chronology of Ernest and Jasper's last days on the property, identify any unusual behavior they might have demonstrated, and determine if there was any reason to believe they could have voluntarily changed their travel plans. The answers he received painted a picture of two men following an established routine, though with obvious family tensions related to Adelaide's attitudes. Ezra Collins, the tracker, began his investigation on the road Ernest and Jasper had followed, looking for signs of their passage or evidence of problems. The work was complicated by the rain that had fallen in previous days, covering many potential clues, but Collins had experience in basic tracking. He found carriage wheel marks on the road near the plantation, but these marks became increasingly difficult to follow as he moved away from the property. Approximately 1 mile from the plantation, in the most isolated section of the road, Collins made a disturbing discovery. There were obvious signs that something violent had happened at that location. The earth was churned up and muddy. There were broken branches on nearby trees and dark stains on the ground that were clearly blood. More importantly, he found fragments of rusty metal that appeared to have come from an old trap, and pieces of fabric caught on nearby bushes that matched descriptions of the clothes Ernest and Jasper wore when they departed. The discovery of these traces transformed what had begun as a missing persons investigation into a homicide investigation. Whitmore ordered a search of the area, mobilizing more men from neighboring plantations. During the following 2 days, the forest around the discovery site was scoured, revealing additional evidence that confirmed something terrible had happened there. The investigators found more clothing fragments scattered through the forest, some stained with human blood. They also discovered the remains of Ernest and Jasper's carriage, hidden in a ravine about half a mile from the road. The carriage had been deliberately destroyed and hidden, indicating that whoever was responsible for the attack had tried to eliminate evidence. More disturbing still, they found human bones buried superficially in different forest locations. The discovery of the bones created a mystery that confused the investigators. The bones were scattered over a wide area. Some showed marks suggesting they had been cut with crude tools, and many of the smaller bones were completely absent. Whitmore consulted the local doctor, Dr. Harrison, who examined the bones and declared they appeared to be human, though the marks on them were consistent with dismemberment using knives or axes in a rustic manner. What most intrigued Whitmore was the crude but effective nature of the crime. The use of an old trap demonstrated opportunism more than sophistication. The rustic dismemberment of the bodies indicated basic knowledge of animal slaughter, and the simple scattering of evidence suggested a desperate attempt to hide traces. It was clear he wasn't dealing with experienced criminals, but with people driven by deep rage and a desire for revenge. Whitmore intensified his interrogations, focusing on the possibility of a conspiracy among slaves. He questioned each person on the plantation about relationships between slaves, possible motives for violence, and any knowledge about escape or rebellion plans. The answers he received were consistently evasive, with each slave denying any knowledge about the events or possible accomplices. Joshua, the young man who had been brutally whipped weeks before, was interrogated multiple times due to Whitmore's obvious suspicions about his possible participation. The sheriff had noticed that Joshua demonstrated signs of extreme nervousness that went beyond the normal fear of a slave being questioned by white authorities. He avoided eye contact, his hands trembled visibly during interrogations, and there was a tension in his posture that suggested deep guilt. But Joshua maintained his story of ignorance, denying any involvement. The search for additional evidence led investigators to the bloodhound kennels, where they made a discovery that provided the final piece of the puzzle. In and around the kennels, they found small fragments of human bones that had been buried superficially in the frozen earth. Dr. Harrison examined these fragments and declared they appeared to be human remains, though he couldn't be absolutely certain without more advanced analysis methods that didn't exist at the time. The discovery of bone fragments in the bloodhound kennels created a new dimension of horror in the investigation. Whitmore understood he was dealing with a crime of brutality that surpassed anything he had encountered before. The use of the plantation's own dogs to eliminate evidence demonstrated intimate knowledge of the property and a calculating coldness that definitely pointed to someone from within the slave community. Simon was interrogated along with all other plantation slaves, but his special position as caretaker of the bloodhounds made him a particular focus of attention. Whitmore was especially interested in knowing if Simon had noticed any unusual behavior in the dogs in the days following Ernest and Jasper's disappearance. Simon responded with appropriate submission, explaining that the dogs had been normal, just a bit hungrier due to the intense winter cold, which was common at this time of year. During the search of the slave quarters, investigators found some evidence that raised suspicions about Simon. In his cabin, they discovered small bloodstains on his clothes. But when questioned about this evidence, Simon explained he had slaughtered a pig a few days before to feed the bloodhounds, a common practice during winter that was confirmed by other slaves. The explanation was plausible but didn't completely dispel the investigators' suspicions. Confronted with the physical evidence found in his cabin and the discovery of bones in the kennels, Simon maintained his story of innocence, but his body language began to show signs of growing tension. Whitmore, experienced in reading people under pressure, perceived that Simon was hiding crucial information. However, without direct evidence linking Simon to the murders and without identifying his accomplices, the sheriff couldn't make a formal arrest. The investigation reached an impasse when it became clear that the slave community was protecting Simon through collective silence. Each interrogated slave maintained the same story. They knew nothing, had seen nothing suspicious, and had no knowledge about any plan of violence. This silence wasn't just fear of white authorities, but a form of mutual protection based on understanding that Simon had done something many of them secretly approved of. Whitmore tried to break this silence by offering rewards for information and threatening collective punishments, but nothing worked. The slave community remained united in their determination to protect Simon and Joshua, even knowing this could result in severe consequences for everyone. This solidarity completely frustrated the sheriff's efforts and demonstrated the level of resentment that existed against the Harding family. On the night of January 12th, after a week of intensive investigation, Simon and Joshua disappeared from the plantation. Their absence was discovered the next morning when Simon didn't appear to feed the bloodhounds, a responsibility he had never neglected in 8 years. An immediate search of the property and surrounding areas revealed no sign of them, as if they had simply vanished into the air during the cold night. The simultaneous flight of Simon and Joshua confirmed Whitmore's suspicions about a conspiracy, but also frustrated any hope of completely solving the case. Without the main suspects to interrogate and without the slave community's cooperation to provide additional information, the investigation stagnated. Whitmore issued wanted posters and alerted authorities in neighboring states, but he knew the chances of capturing the fugitives were minimal, especially in the harsh winter. Adelaide was devastated not only by the confirmation of her father and brother's death, but by the brutal nature of their murders. The discovery that the family's own bloodhounds had been used to eliminate the bodies created deep psychological trauma that would affect her for the rest of her life. She ordered that all 6 dogs be sacrificed immediately, unable to bear the presence of animals that had participated in her family's destruction. In the days following Simon and Joshua's flight, Adelaide made a decision that shocked the entire region. On January 20th, 1853, she signed legal documents freeing all 22 slaves of the Harding plantation, citing her repugnance for the system that created such horrors. This decision, made against the advice of all her relatives and lawyers, effectively destroyed the plantation's economic value and marked the end of the Harding dynasty in Beaufort County. The mass liberation of slaves created shockwaves throughout the region, establishing a dangerous precedent that other owners feared could inspire similar actions. Adelaide was ostracized by local society and eventually moved north, where she joined the abolitionist movement and dedicated the rest of her life to fighting slavery. She never married and never returned to the South, carrying the psychological scars of the 1852 events until her death. Sheriff Whitmore never managed to officially solve the case of the murders at the Harding plantation, although he was certain about the culprit's identity. The lack of direct evidence in the suspect's flight left the case technically open. Whitmore retired a few years later, but remained obsessed with the case until his death, always wondering about the exact details of how Simon and Joshua had executed such a simple but effective plan. The complete truth about the murders of Ernest and Jasper Harding remained buried for more than 3 decades, guarded by the sealed lips of those who had been freed by Adelaide's radical decision. It was only in the late 1880s, when many of the former slaves of the Harding plantation were in their final years of life, that they began sharing their memories with children and grandchildren who had been born free. The revelations came in fragments, whispered in family gatherings and community meetings. Each person contributed pieces of a puzzle that had been carefully guarded for decades. They spoke about Simon and his silent transformation after losing his sister and mother. They told about the subtle signs they had perceived in the days before, Ernest and Jasper's disappearance, and about the atmosphere of expectant tension that had permeated the slave quarters during that harsh winter. The former slaves revealed how Simon had recruited Joshua as his accomplice, taking advantage of the young man's rage and desire for revenge after the brutal whipping he had suffered. They described how the 2 men had planned every aspect of the murders, from discovering and using the old trap to the crude method of eliminating the bodies using the plantation's own bloodhounds. The choice of harsh winter hadn't been a coincidence, but a strategic decision to preserve the meat long enough to feed the dogs. The stories also revealed details about the support network that had protected Simon and Joshua during the investigation. Practically the entire slave community was aware of the revenge plan, and many had contributed in small but crucial ways, providing false alibis, destroying minor evidence, and maintaining absolute silence during interrogations. This collective silence wasn't just fear, but a form of community justice that recognized the legitimacy of Simon's revenge. The accounts described how Simon had used his intimate knowledge of the bloodhounds to transform them into instruments of evidence elimination, feeding them Ernest and Jasper's flesh over 2 days. This strategy had been so effective that even when investigators discovered evidence of possible human flesh consumption by the dogs, they couldn't establish a definitive connection to the murders. For the slave community, Simon and Joshua weren't criminals, but heroes who had brought justice when no other form of justice was available. They had risked their lives to avenge not only their own families, but all the injustices suffered by every enslaved person on the plantation. The revenge had been brutal, but proportional to the years of brutality they had suffered under the Harding regime. The final fate of Simon and Joshua remains a mystery to this day. Some accounts suggest they managed to reach freed slave communities that were forming in Florida, where they lived the rest of their lives under false identities. Others claim they separated after the escape, with Simon heading north through the mountains and Joshua west, never to be seen again in Beaufort County. The Harding plantation never recovered from the events of 1852. The lands were eventually divided and sold. The main house was demolished in the early 20th century, and today only some stone foundations mark the location where one of Beaufort County's most prosperous plantations once existed. Local residents still avoid the area, especially during winter nights, reporting a sense of unease they attribute to the violent memories that still haunt the place. The story of Simon and his revenge became a legend in Southern African American communities, passed from generation to generation as a tale about the horrors of slavery and the price of oppression. For those who knew the truth, Simon was a symbol of resistance and justice, a man who had transformed his pain into action and who had used his oppressor's own tools against them. In the words of one of the last survivors of the Harding plantation, recorded in 1895, Simon did what all of us wanted to do, but didn't have the courage. He showed us that even the most powerful can fall when justice finally comes. He was our hero, our avenger, and we will never forget what he did for all of us. This investigation reminds us that official history often silences the voices of those who lived its darkest pages. Only through the whispers of survivors can we reconstruct the complete truth about events that shaped our society in ways we are still discovering. What did you think of Simon's calculated revenge? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading your perspectives on these dark tales from America's past. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more haunting narratives that explore the shadows of history.